So we have had some major developments and some new rulings involving the NFA's restrictions. A recent 3-judge panel ruling out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has issued a massive ruling that completely shifts the legal landscape for suppressors and the Second Amendment. In a brand new case, US versus Camo, the Fifth Circuit officially ruled that firearm suppressors are in fact protected arms. However, there is a massive catch with that ruling. Even though the individual won the constitutional argument, the defendant still lost the challenge because the panel was completely trapped by a terrible prior ruling out of the Fifth Circuit. But here is the real kicker with this case. 2 of the federal judges on that panel also issued a strong concurrence calling for an emergency en banc review to completely overturn the prior precedent and tear down what they believe was an invalid ruling. So let's break down what happened, how this ties directly into another case, a tragic case dealing with Mr. Peterson and other suppressor restrictions, and why the NFA now officially may be on thin ice based on what is now developed. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. And also to ensure you never miss these videos, make sure you turn on all notifications to get updates on these videos once I release them. Now, to understand how huge this ruling actually was, we have to look back at the devastating precedent that actually just trapped this new defendant in this case. This really all stems from the case US versus Peterson, a major suppressor challenge that we have covered already on this channel. Now, in that Peterson case, law enforcement raided Mr. Peterson's home, found an unregistered suppressor, it was a solvent trap, and the DOJ hit him with a standalone NFA violation that carried a 24-month prison sentence. Mr. Peterson challenged the NFA under the Supreme Court's Bruin framework, and in that case, the Fifth Circuit did something kind of actually dangerous. The Fifth Circuit claimed that the NFA is presumptively lawful because it operates like a shall issue licensing system. Essentially, that panel's ruling established a rule saying that as long as the government has an objective process to register and tax you, the restriction can survive. Peterson appealed that up to the Supreme Court, but recently the Supreme Court refused to step in and denied review to his case. And because of that inaction, Peterson's final request to modify his sentence to simply just some home confinement and home arrest was actually denied. And a couple months ago, he actually had to report to federal prison. Now, his case became a tragic real-world example of the state of this current law. The government could admit that an item is in fact protected, but still lock you in a cage for failing to register it. Now, that brings us directly to the recent ruling out of the Fifth Circuit in US versus Camo. Mr. Camo was prosecuted under the exact same federal statute for possessing an unregistered silencer. He argued that the NFA violated his constitutional rights, but the district court flatly rejected it, claiming that silencers are dangerous and unusual weapons that are not protected by the Second Amendment. Now, in response to that, he then appealed up to the Fifth Circuit, and this new panel just did something unprecedented. The court explicitly ruled in this decision that suppressors absolutely are in fact protected by the Second Amendment. They are in fact protected arms. Now, writing for the court, Judge Jerry Smith dismantled the government's current arguments when it comes to suppressors. The court recognized that suppressors reduce loudness, lower the risk of hearing loss, eliminate muzzle blasts, and also increase accuracy. The court ruled that these are critical functions that make a firearm safer and more effective for the core lawful purpose of self-defense. Under Bruin, an item does not have to be strictly necessary for a gun to actually function. Instead, it just has to facilitate armed self-defense. So this is a massive constitutional win in that case. The Fifth Circuit officially cemented into the law there in the Fifth Circuit that suppressors are protected by the Second Amendment. This also creates a very direct circuit split on this very issue, since the Ninth Circuit recently also ruled that suppressors are not protected arms. This circuit split could also tee up a potential Supreme Court case down the road to address this very issue, but also we just got a notice from the Supreme Court that they're going to be taking up the AR-15 ban cases that really deals with hardware bans. The case out of Illinois and the case out of Connecticut have been granted, and a lot of those laws, the way that they are structured, actually prohibit those types of rifles based on their configurations, based on the characteristics they have, like pistol grips, telescoping stocks, flash hiders, forward vertical grips. And so a lot of the analysis by the Supreme Court will likely also touch on what, are protected arms, can these types of hardware bans be put in place, and, what types of Second Amendment violations are involved with those types of hardware restrictions. So that is something to look at and look forward to based on the Supreme Court looking at those hardware bans and what impact it could have on suppressors. Now, going back to this specific case, you may be thinking, well, if the Fifth Circuit found that suppressors are in fact protected arms, why was he still convicted? Why was his conviction still affirmed by the Fifth Circuit? Well, this is where the frustrating reality of the judicial system really kicks in. Under a legal doctrine known as the rule of orderliness, a 3-judge panel of the appellate court is completely bound by the decisions of prior panels in the same court. Because the previous panel in Peterson manufactured a rule saying that NFA's registration scheme is presumptively lawful unless you can prove exorbitant fees or lengthy wait times, this panel essentially here had to have its hands tied and had to rule this way. Mr. Comeau here in this case hadn't explicitly alleged that the ATF put the application process to abusive ends, so under the Peterson precedent, his challenge was forced to fail at step 1. But in this case, the judges openly admitted that because Peterson controls the circuit, they had no choice but to uphold the conviction, but there was a block of judges on this ruling that disagreed with Peterson and said that they need to revisit that precedent. And that's really where this story kind of takes a wild turn, because you had the circuit judge there, Edith Brown Clement, who was joined also by one of the judges, Stuart Kyle Duncan, and they issued a fierce and kind of fiery concurrence essentially aimed directly at destroying Peterson and that precedent and telling the rest of the judges on the Fifth Circuit that they need to take a fresh look at that precedent. They wrote separately to state bluntly that Peterson was a massive mistake that needs to be revisited and overturned by the full en banc panel in the Fifth Circuit. She pointed out that Peterson took a random, modest footnote out of the Supreme Court's Bruin ruling and twisted it into a binding legal doctrine. By creating a presumption that shall issue registration systems are automatically legal, Peterson flipped Bruin completely on its head and resurrected interest balancing, which the Supreme Court also expressly rejected in Bruin. Now, this was very interesting because on this same ruling, you had 2 of the 3 federal judges on that very panel officially come out and really put out the back signal to the rest of the Fifth Circuit, calling for the full bench to grant en banc review to essentially do away and eliminate that Peterson ruling because they believe it's leading to these improper rulings against individuals like Mr. Comeau. So what does this mean moving forward? Well, it means that the battle over the NFA is far from over, and in fact, just actually accelerated based on this ruling. Now, currently, his legal team, in this case, Mr. Comeau, is almost certainly going to file a petition for en banc rehearing based on the language of the court here, based on the 2 concurring opinions saying that they need to revisit that. And so I assume that that will also happen, and we will see if the Fifth Circuit full panel will want to take a new case up like this and relook at this very issue. But like I mentioned, we also have a situation where California and their suppressor restriction was upheld by the Ninth Circuit. So you have a circuit split on this very issue of whether suppressors are protected arms. You have the Fifth Circuit saying that they are protected arms. The state of California and the Ninth Circuit are saying, no, they are not protected arms. And also with the looming Supreme Court arguments and hearings and an eventual decision next term in the AR-15 hardware ban cases, that could directly impact some of these other issues because, that plays into what is an arm, what are protected arms, what type of restrictions could be put in place on these types of protected arms. So the cracks currently right now against the NFA are even wider than they have really ever been. And we're going to see a lot develop probably over this next Supreme Court term. And, going forward to the end of this year into next year, we're going to see a lot developing around the NFA, but are just arms bans issues in general. So let me know what you think about this down below. Will the full Fifth Circuit actually step in and override that Peterson ruling that they recently issued? Let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know what you think about the NFA in general. And if you think eventually, it will be the standard across the nation that suppressors are protected arms. Again, let me know down below. If you like this type of video and you want to ensure that you get these videos going forward, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and turn on all notifications to ensure you never miss these videos when I release them. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.